guys see from the title, just to jump into the video, I am going to be discussing kind of my 2 high-risk pregnancies. And the reason I'm filming this video is just to share my experience of high-risk pregnancy, but it's also to bring awareness to high-risk pregnancy because it is very common. Also, I wanted to film this video to give kind of advice and hope to other women that are going through high-risk pregnancies. Obviously, every high-risk pregnancy is different and high risk for a different reason and gonna have its own challenges, but I just wanted to, in general, talk about high-risk pregnancy today as it pertains to my own experience and kind of give my advice and my hope. I'm not a doctor, so don't take this as medical advice, but just like advice from person to person, right? As I said, I have a 2.5-year-old who turns 3 in March and a baby who just turned 5 months old. I have 2 daughters. So I'll get into why my pregnancies were high risk and things like that first. So if you guys have been following us for a while, you know that we struggled with infertility for 3 years with our first daughter, Anna. So when I got pregnant with Anna, we didn't have a diagnosis. We had a diagnosis of unexplained infertility, which is essentially we don't know in the medical community. And so they didn't really know why I was struggling to get pregnant. And so they did do extra tests when I was pregnant with Anna to make sure that there was no things that they had missed. And there wasn't. There was no endometriosis. There was no PCOS. There was no abnormalities in like my uterus. Those were the things they did extra tests for. And so in the beginning of Anna's pregnancy, I was not classified high risk because they didn't find anything, and they just said, okay, you were classified unexplained infertility. Now you got pregnant after 3 years. We're not sure. Nothing is popping up like an alarm. So I wasn't classified high risk in the beginning. However, around, I believe it was about, with Anna, I believe it was about like 13 or 14 weeks that it began. It got progressively worse, but I think the first like alarm bell happened around 13 or 14 weeks where they were like, hey, your blood pressures are a little sporadic, a little all over the place, slightly elevated. And they were telling me that, you know, they needed to monitor it and kind of look and see what was going on. They did some further tests to make sure I wasn't getting preeclampsia, which they didn't think I was at that point because that's usually something that happens after 20 weeks, but it can happen before 20 weeks. And so they did some other tests, blood, urine, mostly. And I did not have preeclampsia at that point. And they said that, you know, let's monitor it. They monitored it for about 2 more weeks, and they basically diagnosed me in my first pregnancy with gestational hypertension, which is a condition that is considered high risk in a pregnancy. It is manageable, but it's definitely high risk. And I will just link, because I don't even remember all of them, but I'm going to show you here all of the risks that come with that. But one of the main risks that comes with pregnancy-related hypertension is that it could develop into preeclampsia. And preeclampsia is a life-threatening disease to both mother and baby. And basically, the treatment to preeclampsia, if it gets severe, is delivery of the baby. So when someone has gestational hypertension or preeclampsia or any kind of hypertension disorder in pregnancy, the goal is to manage that high blood pressure, one, to stop it from becoming preeclampsia, but also two, to get the pregnancy to a safe viability so that in the event of an emergency delivery, we have a viable, healthy baby. So with my first pregnancy, yes, it was classified high risk around like 15 weeks. I don't remember the exact week, but we were definitely like early 2nd trimester. And it was classified high risk because of sporadic blood pressures. During that first pregnancy, when they discovered the gestational hypertension, so let's go back a little bit. They discovered that around like 13 weeks, like I said, but they monitored it before making a diagnosis for about 2 weeks. But once they discovered that, hey, something's going on with your blood pressure and it looks a little crazy, a little weird, they told me to go ahead and start taking daily aspirin, 81 milligrams. Usually aspirin is not really something you would take during pregnancy, but in the event of high blood pressure, it can help with it not progressing to preeclampsia. So people with history of high blood pressure or gestational hypertension or other hypertension disorders, usually they will tell you to take a low dose baby aspirin once to twice a day. And this helps it not progress to preeclampsia, and it also helps you one of the risk of pregnancy in general, but it's slightly higher in people with high blood pressure during pregnancy, is blood clots. So it also helps with no blood clotting. It helps with just cardiovascular health in your pregnancy, and most importantly, in my situation and in other similar situations, they would be giving it to you to prevent preeclampsia. Preeclampsia can still happen, but it's a way to try and prevent. So in my first pregnancy, that was the main issue, and basically I took the aspirin, and I also monitored my blood pressures. I had extra appointments. So any high risk person is going to have extra appointments. So I had extra appointments. I had about 2 extra sonograms to make sure, because if your blood pressure gets really bad, you can have growth restriction as well. I never had growth restriction with my pregnancies, but it is a risk factor for blood pressure issues in pregnancy. And so they did monitor baby closer. They also did NSTs. If you don't know what NSTs are, I'll put it here. And basically they did NSTs every week from about, with Anna, my first daughter, it was every week till from about 33 weeks, I believe. I believe it was till from 33 weeks. And so I went with Anna. It was actually twice a week, if I remember correctly. My NSTs were twice a week. That is a way to get close monitor on baby. And the NSTs are, depending on how baby's doing, how good baby's doing, NSTs are about 20 to 30 minutes. Sometimes if there's like a little bit of discrepancies of how good baby's doing, it could be up to an hour, but normally 20 to 30 minutes of monitoring. And then they'll come and they will review your notes and let you go, basically. NSTs is just a way to monitor baby. They monitor the baby's heart rate, they monitor your contractions, and it's just like a way to get a closer look. So that was what I did. Extra appointments, NSTs, baby aspirin, things like that. And on my end, just knowing that I had this hypertension in pregnancy, I tried to not be stressed. My first pregnancy, when I first got diagnosed, with a high risk pregnancy, it kind of wasn't surprising to me, because as someone who had went through infertility, I kind of knew that the pregnancy was gonna have some type of surprise. But I did go through like oh wow, I'm high risk. But I wasn't too worried. I had a really positive mindset my first pregnancy, and I knew that I just had a good feeling about it, and I thought that I was going to be able to monitor my blood pressures. I did monitor at home, as I mentioned, and you monitor twice a day, every day. So in the morning when I woke up, I had to take my blood pressure and write it down, and in the evening, like I think they would say 3 hours after dinner, you would take it and write it down. With my first pregnancy, my blood pressures were kind of all over the place. However, they were higher in the hospital, always. They always are, because I do suffer from white coat syndrome as well. If you guys don't know, I think I've mentioned this in a couple blogs, but I have like anxiety disorder. And my anxiety is pretty under control in the last couple of years. But one of my main things that trigger my anxiety is like health related anxiety, hospitals, doctor's appointments, and like health related things. And so pregnancy is definitely challenging for me in that you are going to the doctor very frequently. You are kind of like thrown into medical situations frequently, especially as someone who got diagnosed with high risk. Like I said, I had extra appointments, so extra anxiety, and also the anxiety of worrying that something will go wrong with your baby. So all of that, I did have a little bit extra anxiety with my first pregnancy, because health anxiety is one of my triggers, and so it was slightly triggering. But I do meditation every day, and I was in a positive mind state, and I stayed really positive. Everything worked out in my first pregnancy. But what happened was at 38 weeks, my blood pressure did skyrocket at home. So one of the reasons it is important to monitor your blood pressures even at home and keep those logs and give them to your doctor so they can see your progress and see how you're going even when you're not in the hospital is, one, in my case, so that they can actually see that the blood pressures are a lot higher in the hospital and that there is some white coat syndrome going on. But the other reason is so that if you are getting higher blood pressures in the house, we can start to see that, hey, I think this is moving towards a dangerous area. So they had told me, and please don't quote me on this, I am not a doctor. This is what my medical team advised for my husband and I in our first pregnancy. They had told me that based on my elevations and everything, that basically if I take my blood pressure at home and it's over 150 on the top number and over 90 on the bottom, wait 10 minutes, take it again. If it's still over, call labor and delivery for further instruction. So there were maybe one or two times in like the late second and early third trimester where that did happen, and I would call. One time the nurses told me to, based on the numbers and based on my logs, to just rest, and I did, and it went down on its own. And there were two times during my first pregnancy where I was admitted to the hospital. So the way it worked was I had an elevation in blood pressure, I think one during my second trimester and one during my third trimester where I was hospitalized. So what would happen was I took my blood pressure at home. I think one happened in the morning and one happened in the evening. Took my blood pressure at home. It was over 150, over 90. I think the bottom number usually stayed normal, but I have issues with the top during pregnancy. And so I don't remember what my blood pressure was exactly during that first and second hospitalization, but it was definitely over the recommended number. And I called labor and delivery. At that point, they told me to come in for monitoring. When I went in for monitoring, they basically hook you up um to the monitor. The baby's crying, but she's with Sam. So um they basically hook you up to the monitor, which I said is just like getting an NST, but you're in labor and delivery now. They watch your contractions, they watch baby's heartbeat. They did a couple other tests as well because I was there for blood pressure monitoring. And in blood pressure monitoring, they hook you up to a cuff and they hook the machine up to take your blood pressures automatically every, I believe it's every 10 or every 15 minutes. And they sit you there for at least 3 hours and they get a list of blood pressures. And then from there, you kind of know what to do. Okay, so yeah, so that would happen. That happened like twice in my first pregnancy where my blood pressure went high. Like I said, once in the second trimester, I think once in the third. And it went higher than they are comfortable with, and I had to go in for monitoring. Like I said, they would do blood work, so they would always test when I went in for monitoring if it had turned to preeclampsia or not. So they would monitor the blood pressure for about 3 hours to see if it goes down, if it stays elevated, if so, how elevated, things like that. But on top of that, each time that I was hospitalized, they also did a urine sample, blood work, um, and they also would make me do the 24-hour urine test, which I'll explain here. But basically, the 24-hour urine test collects your urine for 24 hours and then tests how much of certain things, levels of things you have in the urine within a 24-hour period, which is a better indication of if you're preeclamptic or not, if you have proteins in the urine or not, than just a one-off urine sample. So I did that twice. And basically, they told me, you know, both times they were like, well, it's not preeclampsia, it never progressed to preeclampsia, but, your hypertension is concerning. And, they would have to monitor me. They did monitor me, and the team did a really good job at just like managing both my high riskness and taking care of me and baby, but also keeping me calm and happy during my first pregnancy. I had a really good birth team, a really good pregnancy team, labor team, all of it. And so what happened with Anna's delivery is directly linked to why I was scheduled induced with my second daughter. Also, it is directly linked to why I was high risk. So I had gestational hypertension, and so like I said, I was monitoring. And so there were those two indications, those two times where we went into the hospital and we were monitored, and we were sent home told to continue to monitor, continue lifestyle, healthy lifestyle, and continue the aspirin. Now this next time that I'm going to tell you about leads into like the more high riskness, where I was 38 weeks and 3 days, and I took my blood pressure in the morning like I always did, and it was pretty normal. I was getting some symptoms, so they do tell you to watch out for certain symptoms when you have pregnancy-related hypertension. Watch out for certain symptoms that it could be turning into preeclampsia, one of which is swelling. However, swelling is also common in the 3rd trimester. So I did have some swelling going on, but when my doctor had seen me, I had also called the nurse's line. It all seemed normal, and my blood pressures were staying stabilized. They were slightly elevated, but for me and my condition, it was stabilized. And so when I took my blood pressure that morning, it was normal. And then later on that day, it was around 10 at night. I remember that I was 38 weeks already, so I was really close to my due date, and so I was doing all my due date, my labor prep work. And I literally remember that I was doing my labor ball, doing my exercises, and it had been a few hours since dinner, and I said, okay, it's time to take my blood pressure. I did not feel weird whatsoever. I didn't have any other symptoms besides some swelling that I attributed to 3rd trimester swelling. So some of the symptoms they tell you to look out for like possible turning to preeclampsia or possible or really, really high blood pressure in pregnancy are vision changes, tunnel vision, severe headache that does not go away with Tylenol, rib pain, specifically on the right side, vomiting, dizziness, I think I'm remembering them all, or swelling, specifically in the face. I did have some swelling in my hands and face, but it was mostly around my nose, which also does happen to some women just generally in 3rd trimester. But when you have high blood pressure, hypertension, pregnancy-related hypertension, preeclampsia, all of the things, it is more important to watch out for these things. And we were watching. They were monitoring, and they were aware that things were kind of progressing, but they also were aware that I was so close to delivery and it was my first baby, so we didn't know what was normal for me and what wasn't. I was on my exercise ball and I was doing all my exercises, and then I realized that it had been a couple hours since dinner, and I realized it was time to take my blood pressure. And we took my evening blood pressure. As I said, I had no symptoms to think anything. I was just doing the normal. I always took it in the morning and in the evening. It was around, I want to say close to 10 o'clock, maybe like 9:45. And it was 3 hours or so after I had eaten dinner, which is when they normally tell you to take your evening blood pressure. I took it, and I believe the number at that point was like over 160 on the top, over 100 on the bottom, which is completely high. A real indicator that you might be heading towards preeclampsia, and it's definitely what they told me to look out for and call in about. So immediately what my husband and I did was call the labor and delivery, explain that I was 38 and a half weeks pregnant, that this was my first pregnancy, that I had gestational hypertension. We explained that I had had it since basically midway through pregnancy. We explained that we were being seen at the clinic. We explained everything to the nurse basically, and she asked us a few questions. We answered those questions, and she told us, come in, we will evaluate you, we will monitor you, but because you are over 30 weeks, bring your stuff just in case you get admitted for labor. But at this point, they didn't know if I was going to get admitted for labor or not. She wanted to just monitor, but because I was over 30 weeks, bring your stuff, which we had done before. When I got admitted, I said in my 3rd trimester, I had got admitted one other time for high blood pressure. They had told us the same thing because we were over 30 weeks at that time. We were about 32 to 33 weeks. The second time that I had got admitted and sent home. So this was the 3rd time that I was going in for blood pressure monitoring. And because I was over 30 weeks, again, I brought my stuff with me. So we didn't specifically think that we were going to go into labor that night, but we also were like, maybe, because we are 38 weeks and that is considered full term. Okay. So after 37 weeks, you are, not full term. After 37 weeks, you are to term, which is considered completely safe to deliver. And if there's any complications, that's usually what they do. And then obviously 40 weeks is full term, and over 40 weeks is overdue. So we were in that general clearance. So we were like, they might deliver us today. But at the same time, we were like, my blood pressure had a tendency of, like, when I would do the monitoring, it would start off really high, and within that 3-hour span it would drop and goes back to normal, and my body would kind of relax back, and they would just be like, okay, you're fine. So I was like, I don't know, but I was trying not to stress. So we headed to the hospital. We went in. They did the same thing they did the last couple times. They did some blood work, urine, and they hooked me up to the monitors, contraction on one monitor, baby's heartbeat on the other. They were also monitoring my blood pressure every 10 to 15 minutes and my own heart rate and vitals and stuff like that. Usually when they see you having like a high blood pressure, first thing they do is try to hydrate you. So the first thing they do is hook you up to IV fluids. They did that. When I got to the hospital, my blood pressure was still high, but it had dropped a few points from when I was at home. And so they were like, this is still really concerning, but at least it's dropping. Let's see what happens. This time I was really close to delivering anyway. So I was in the hospital for, I would say, like an hour and a half being monitored. And the head nurse came with the doctor and said, you do not have preeclampsia as of this moment. However, preeclampsia is something, so that she had got my labs back at this point. It had been almost 2 hours. She had got my labs back and said, like, you do not have preeclampsia at this moment, which is great. However, at this stage of pregnancy and with what's going on, with how high your blood pressures are going, the fact that you've already been admitted twice, the fact that you are late in your 3rd trimester and you're going to give birth in the next 2 weeks anyway, we don't feel comfortable sending you home, because if we send you home, preeclampsia can happen overnight. So you cannot have preeclampsia right now. We send you home, and because you're already so far along in your pregnancy, you could wake up and be totally preeclamptic, and this could become an emergency, whereas right now it's a manageable situation. It's a manageable situation that's not like an acute emergency, but it could turn to acute emergency very quickly. And so she was like, I want to talk to my team and kind of see what's best. So she was like, are you okay with me having a discussion with the team on whether or not it is the best interest to continue your pregnancy or to start labor now? And I was totally ready at that point, and I also wanted to do the safest thing. I had researched all the risk, and I knew that it was safe to deliver at 38 and 3, and that you are to term. Not full term 40 weeks, but you are to term. Basically that my baby would not be a preemie, and that we got into a good point in the pregnancy. I knew that at this point I was healthy and she was healthy, and I didn't want anything to take a turn for the worse. So I told her, yes, I'm okay with that conversation. The team, which included 2 midwives, my nursing staff, which were like 3 nurses, a pediatrician, the head nurse, I think like 2 doctors, and a few other support staff, had a conversation. She came back to me and my husband within like 20 minutes and said, listen, we think the best thing, since you are already almost 39 weeks and since you are showing signs that you might tip towards preeclampsia in the next couple days, is that we don't even let you go a couple days. We would like to start your induction tonight and have baby, whenever baby wants to show up in the next 24 hours. And I was okay with that. I was actually really excited because I was done being pregnant. I wanted the safety, like I said, and I was also really excited to meet our baby girl. So I was totally for it. We already had our bags and everything. We basically called my mom to watch our dog, and we were good to go. And we had an induction, a Pitocin induction. If you guys want more details on that, you can watch our first pregnancy, labor, and delivery story, where we get into details about the entire induction process, pregnancy, labor, and delivery with our first daughter. So I'll link it here. But basically, we had an induction because of the pregnancy-related hypertension with my first. But that was an emergency induction. It wasn't like an emergency, but it was not a planned induction. So going into my second pregnancy, we already knew that I had a history of gestational hypertension, and my gestational hypertension with my second showed up quicker. It showed up around like 10 weeks. But this time around, they knew right away. So as soon as I hit 12 weeks, I started the aspirin. And this time I also took a pill to manage blood pressure. I don't remember what week this started, but I believe it was like midway to my second trimester. I believe it was around 24, 25 weeks. They started me on a blood pressure medication that is safe for pregnancy. So I did the aspirin and that. My pregnancy this time, the blood pressures were very well managed. I believe because of the medication, but when I was off the medication, they were a lot more sporadic than my first, which is very typical. It's very typical when you have a high-risk pregnancy for the high-risk component to be worse more as you do multiple pregnancies. However, my second pregnancy was further complicated than my first because at 20, I believe it was like 24 weeks as well, around that same time, I got diagnosed with gestational diabetes, which I did not have with my first. And so when I got diagnosed with gestational diabetes, to be honest, you guys, the diagnosis with me with gestational diabetes was very hard on me, mentally and physically. It just really put me down because I felt like my pregnancy was further complicated. There are all these complications that could happen to your baby with hypertension and possible preeclampsia, and then there's a whole nother list of things that could happen with gestational diabetes. And even though they're just a could happen, and I love my team and they monitored me great, just the thought that all those things could happen to your baby that you're growing inside of you is very difficult. Also, with gestational diabetes, I had to switch my diet. I was already very restricted in my second pregnancy because I just had a lot of food aversions already. And so having to switch my diet, having to take the blood sugars 3 times a day, having to like monitor my food while pregnant in that way, having to worry about all the complications of gestational diabetes, and also having to manage the diet of hypertension and the monitoring of the hypertension and the extra appointments, and all of that was a lot on my mental health. But we got through it, and at first I was very devastated and I didn't know how I was going to manage all that, like all of the things I was saying. But honestly, after a few months, it became kind of normal. It was still difficult, but it wasn't as devastating. And as I started to realize that my blood sugars were getting under control with the nutritionist diet and with me monitoring them, I felt safer. But I always have anxiety while pregnant because I have high-risk pregnancies. And so yeah, that was why my second pregnancy was more complicated, because I now had gestational hypertension and gestational diabetes, which kind of like fought against each other. If you guys don't know, all of these things, gestational hypertension, gestational diabetes, are a result of like abnormalities in the placenta and the way your body reacts to growing a placenta. So the placenta is a separate organ from you and baby, and it's an organ that connects you and baby, nurtures baby through mom. But the mother literally grows the placenta from scratch. It's an organ that you grow. And things can go wrong with that, and that's kind of like where that comes from. They don't know fully, as far as what my doctors told me, they don't know fully the cause of why that happens, but they know it has something to do with the placenta. And so I guess my body just reacts that way. And it is normal for, like I said, when you have multiple pregnancies, if you've had a high-risk pregnancy, for the high riskness to kind of stack on top of each other. It is kind of relatively common that if you have one complication with a first pregnancy, you'll have 2 with a second, 3 with a third, like that. And your pregnancies will get progressively more high risk, unfortunately. And that is something that you have to talk to your own doctor with regards to the decision to have more biological children or not. And that is something that we spoke to our doctor with, and we that is one of the reasons we decided that we are not going to have more biological children. One of the reasons, like saying that I don't want to further the risk, because it would be more risky to have a third biological child. And I don't want to further the risk. I have 2 beautiful daughters that I am happy with. And I also have 2 beautiful daughters and a family to be here for. So that's part of that. So during my second pregnancy, yes, it was definitely more complicated because now I had 2 complications. However, during my second pregnancy, because it was my second pregnancy, we were able to monitor it better and manage it better. We knew how my body reacted to certain things in pregnancy, especially when it came to the high blood pressure, because I already had it, and then the gestational diabetes was very well controlled. I did have to have extra sonograms, so this time I think I had like 3 extra sonograms. I did still do NST, this time once a week instead of twice. And I did take a extra high blood pressure management medication during my second pregnancy that I didn't take with my first, along with aspirin. This time I took aspirin twice a day instead of once. And I also had a scheduled induction. So I scheduled my induction. So with my first daughter, I delivered at 38 and 3 days, but it was unscheduled. They decided that because that's when my body goes haywire, when it comes to the blood pressure, we delivered at exactly that, 38 and 3 again, but this time it was scheduled. I knew I was having a scheduled induction. They scheduled me. I went in. I knew it. And honestly, both inductions were positive induction experiences. There were some difficulties, and if you want to know that birth story, I will link my second birth story below too, or above. But all in all, I would say I would counsel people to prepare for your induction, educate yourself, and really get into a zen place about it. But if you need to have an induction, it is really not the end of the world. It still can be a beautiful birth experience, and it was for me both times. And my advice to any parents going through high-risk pregnancies would be to, like I said, educate yourself, but try not to scare yourself. Take it one day at a time, because I know it's a lot. It's a lot. General pregnancy is a lot, but those high-risk pregnancies is a lot, with the added pressure, the added appointments, and just the added worry. So take it one day at a time. Really listen to your care team. Find a care team that you really, really trust, and really work on holistic things that also just manage your stress. And because even though I believe that the medication did help my blood pressure, I also believe that staying in a zen place, doing hypnobirthing, and doing those things kept me positive and kept my blood pressure regulated. So if you guys have any other questions about my high-risk pregnancy, about high-risk pregnancy in general, or any other questions for like you, obviously I can't answer medical questions, but if you have any other questions, advice, tips, or videos you would like to see about my experience, leave them in the comments below. If not, I will see you guys next week. And like I said, we're working on our schedule, so we'll be back shortly with more content, so please be patient. But as always, it was great talking to you guys, and see you next week.